$34 trillion. That's how much debt the United States government owes right now. Not 34 billion, not 34 million, 34 trillion. To put that in perspective, if you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you over 90,000 years to spend that much money. The entire U.S. economy, the largest in human history, produces roughly $28 trillion worth of goods and services in a year. The debt is bigger than the economy itself. And yet, nothing has collapsed. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency. Treasury bonds are still considered the safest investment on the planet. America can borrow more money tomorrow at interest rates other countries can only dream of. So what's going on? Is this a ticking bomb, or have we all fundamentally misunderstood how government debt actually works? Here's why this question isn't academic anymore. In 1981, the national debt crossed $1 trillion for the first time. Politicians called it a national crisis. Economists warned of disaster. 43 years later, we've multiplied that number by 34, and somehow we're still here. But something has changed recently. The U.S. government now spends more on interest payments for this debt than it does on national defense. Over $1 trillion a year just servicing what we owe. That's more than Medicare. More than we spend on veterans, transportation, and education combined. And that number is accelerating. So either we're living through the greatest economic magic trick in history, or we're passengers on a plane that's been in a slow descent for decades and nobody's noticed yet because the ride's been smooth. Let's figure out which one it is. First, we need to understand how government debt is different from the debt you and I carry. When you borrow money, you have to pay it back. Eventually, someone wants their cash. But when the U.S. government borrows money, it does something weird. It issues a bond. And that bond isn't really debt in the way you think about debt. It's more like a subscription. Here's what I mean. When you buy a U.S. Treasury bond, you're essentially giving the government money today in exchange for a promise that they'll pay you back with interest over time. Could be 1 year, could be 30 years. The government gets cash now, you get a reliable income stream later. But here's the trick. When that bond matures and the government has to pay you back, they don't actually pay you back with money they earned. They pay you back by issuing another bond to someone else. They borrow from Peter to pay Paul, then they borrow from Jane to pay Peter. Then they borrow from a pension fund in Tokyo to pay Jane. It's a chain that never has to end as long as people keep buying the bonds. And people keep buying the bonds because U.S. Treasury bonds are considered the single safest asset in the world. Safer than gold, safer than real estate, safer than anything. Why? Because the U.S. government has something no person, no company, and virtually no other country has. It controls the currency it borrows in. Let's sit with that for a second. If you owe someone $100,000, you have to go earn that money somehow. You can't just print it. But the U.S. government borrows in dollars, and the U.S. government, through the Federal Reserve, can create dollars. Not literally print them, though they do that too. Mostly it's digital. The Fed types numbers into a computer, and those dollars exist. This seems insane, and in a way it is. But it's also the entire foundation of the modern financial system. Here's the part that breaks most people's brains. The national debt doesn't need to be paid off. It never has been. It just needs to be manageable. What does manageable mean? It means as long as the economy keeps growing, the debt can keep growing too. Because what matters isn't the absolute size of the debt, it's the debt compared to the size of the economy. Think of it like this. If you make $50,000 a year and you owe $10,000 on a credit card, that's manageable. If you make $500,000 a year and owe $100,000, that's even more manageable, even though the debt is 10 times bigger. For most of the last century, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio hovered between 30 and 60%, totally sustainable. But after the 2008 financial crisis, it jumped. After COVID, it exploded.
Now we're sitting at around 125%. That's higher than any time in U.S. history except for World War II. And unlike World War II, there's no post-war boom coming to grow us out of it. So why hasn't this collapsed yet? Because there's a mechanism holding it all together, and that mechanism is global demand for safety. Every government, every central bank, every pension fund, every corporation that operates internationally needs a place to park money that won't disappear. And for the last 80 years, that place has been U.S. Treasury bonds. Not because America is perfect, not because the debt is small, but because the alternatives are worse. Europe is fragmented. China's government controls its markets in ways that scare foreign investors. Japan has its own aging population and debt crisis. Emerging markets are too risky. So when there's a crisis anywhere in the world, money flows into U.S. bonds. When COVID hit, when banks collapsed in 2023, when wars break out, investors buy treasuries. It's called flying to safety. This creates a paradox. The worse things get globally, the easier it becomes for the U.S. to borrow. And the U.S. has weaponized this. We sanction countries by cutting them off from the dollar system. We fund massive programs because we can borrow at rates lower than inflation, meaning we're effectively getting paid to borrow. But this only works if everyone believes it will keep working. Now let's talk about what people get wrong. The hype, we're going to default, the dollar will collapse, hyperinflation is coming. You hear this from politicians during debt ceiling fights. You hear it from doomsday investors selling gold. You hear it every time the debt hits a new round number. It hasn't happened. The reality, default isn't the risk. The risk is something slower and more insidious. Here's what's actually happening. As the debt grows, more and more of the federal budget gets eaten up by interest payments. Remember, we're already past $1 trillion a year. If interest rates stay elevated, that number keeps climbing. That means less money for everything else. Schools get a little less funding. The military has to make cuts. Social Security becomes harder to sustain. It's not a cliff, it's a slow fade. And there's another risk nobody talks about. What happens when the rest of the world stops needing dollars? Right now, oil is priced in dollars. International trade is conducted in dollars. Central banks hold dollars. But that's changing at the margins. China and Russia are settling trade in their own currencies. The BRICS nations are exploring alternatives. The European Union has been trying for years to make the euro a rival reserve currency. None of this will happen overnight. The dollar's dominance is structural, institutional, built into the plumbing of global finance. But if it does happen, even slowly, the consequences are brutal. If global demand for dollars falls, the U.S. can't borrow as cheaply. If we can't borrow as cheaply, we either have to cut spending, raise taxes, or print money. Cutting spending is politically toxic. Raising taxes is politically toxic. Printing money causes inflation. There's no easy way out. And here's the really uncomfortable part. We might already be on that path. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2050, interest on the debt could consume nearly 40% of all federal revenue. Not 40% of spending, 40% of revenue. At that point, you're not running a country, you're running a debt servicing machine that occasionally governs. The entire system rests on an assumption that barely anyone questions. Economic growth will continue forever. The U.S. economy has to keep expanding, productivity has to keep rising, tax revenue has to keep climbing. Because if it doesn't, the math stops working. Japan tried to grow their way out of a debt crisis in the 90s. They're still trying. Their debt-to-GDP ratio is over 250% now. They've had near zero interest rates for 30 years. Their population is shrinking. The U.S. isn't Japan. Our demographics are better. Our economy is more dynamic. Our currency is the global reserve. But we're not immune to the same forces. And the scariest part is, we don't actually know where the breaking point is. There's no textbook that says debt becomes unsustainable at exactly 150% of GDP, or the dollar loses reserve status at precisely this moment. It's all uncharted territory. Here's the absurd irony in all of this. The people who scream loudest about the national debt are often the same people who vote for tax cuts that make it worse. The people who worry most about government spending tend to live in states that receive more federal funding than they pay in. And the rest of us? We've learned to ignore it. 34 trillion is a number so large it becomes meaningless. It's abstract. It doesn't affect your rent, your paycheck, your grocery bill. Except it does, slowly, through inflation, through deteriorating public services, through the opportunities your government can't invest in because it's too busy servicing debt. It's a crisis in slow motion, which is the most dangerous kind, because slow-motion crises don't generate urgency. So why hasn't anything collapsed yet? Because the system is
more resilient than the doomsayers think, and more fragile than the optimists believe. The U.S. can keep borrowing as long as the world keeps lending. The world will keep lending as long as there's no better alternative. There's no better alternative as long as the dollar remains the global reserve currency. The dollar remains the global reserve currency as long as the U.S. economy stays dominant. It's a circle, and circles hold until they don't. The real question isn't whether 34 trillion is too much. The real question is, how much room do we have left before we find out? Because eventually, every magic trick gets explained. Every illusion breaks. And when this one does, there won't be a backup plan. We're not staring at a collapse. We're staring at a slow erosion of options. Each year, the room to maneuver gets smaller. Each crisis, we borrow a little more. Each generation inherits a problem slightly harder to solve than the one before. The debt hasn't destroyed us yet, but it's already decided what we can't do, what we can't build, what we can't become. And that might be the real cost we're not counting.